What I'd like to do today is share with you some information about some of the issues that we're facing here in the United States, actually worldwide, when it comes to consumer resources, generating waste, and the challenges that we're having with trying to use recycling to solve all those problems. And I want to talk about ways to kind of rethink recycling and waste management, and then outline steps for how we could create a zero waste community here in Tucson, and give you some examples of what other communities are doing. Zero waste is a concept that really got off the ground, started back in the 1990s, and many communities around the world have adopted zero waste plans. And I think it's something that it's worth pursuing here in Tucson. The first point I want to make, and this is not going to be surprising to anybody, but we live in a disposable society. We don't value the importance of materials and resources. We don't know where they're coming from, where they're going. We sort of have this out of sight, out of mind attitude towards the waste that we're generating. The problem with our economic system or production system is that it's one way, and it's from earth to disposal. We take things, we extract stuff, we make stuff, we use it. In some cases, we only use it for a few minutes, and then it gets tossed into the garbage can, or perhaps into a recycling bin. And the final thing is that most of the product and marketing decisions are dominated by design for convenience and disposability. That really got started with that in the 1950s. We were moving to more convenient, disposable consumer products. Now, the amount of garbage that we're generating has been rising fast. Again, it shouldn't be a surprise to you. In the past century, waste production rose tenfold worldwide. And in fact, trash is being generated faster than any other environmental pollutant. And the world generates 2.0 billion tons of municipal waste annually. And by 2050, it's expected to generate 3.4 billion tons of solid waste annually. While we're consuming too much, we're really stressing out our natural resources worldwide. The amount of material that the world uses have tripled since 1970, could double again by 2060 if we continue sort of on this business as usual path, which is, there's a potential that could happen. Natural resources to use to satisfy a person's need was 8.1 tons annually in 1990, and we're almost at 12 tons of resources that they have to be extracted in 2015. So that's going the wrong way too.
Kevin, do you know if those tonnages are for industrial materials? Because the food would be a whole lot more.
Well, it's primarily what I would call residential waste stream, household waste stream. I think that industrial waste tend to be tracked separately. So this would be mainly for the goods that we're buying and the food that we're eating.
Thanks.
What's our garbage footprint? And which is kind of interesting because I was born in 1952, so I've kind of seen the changes over the years, and in terms of the amount of material that we've been using in the U.S. Or generating waste material. 1960, 2.6 pounds per person per day. 1980, which was kind of before the advent of a lot of community recycling programs that were brought online, increased to 3.66 pounds per person per day. And in 2018, it rose to 4.9 pounds per person per day. So obviously we are, you know, we haven't capped off, we haven't hit a ceiling yet. We're continuing to generate on a yearly basis over, you know, when you look long term, more and more waste each year. What makes up our municipal waste stream? Well, you know, paperboard, that shouldn't be a big surprise. 3/4 of our waste, municipal waste. Again, this is not industrial waste, our products and packaging. What I've noticed in the last 20 years or so is that paper and paperboard waste is declined a little bit. And I think that's because of the internet and doing more electronic sharing of files and reports. So it's come down a little bit. Plastics production generation plastics production waste has increased over the last 10 years, which shouldn't be surprising, and as we've moved to more and more disposable products. But interestingly, the one that really stands out for me, and that goes to something Trace mentioned, food waste increased from 30.7 million tons in 2010 to 63 million tons in 2018. That's almost a doubling in over a 20-year period. And I'll touch more about food waste, the importance of beginning to address that. Where does our waste go? Well, 50%. You know, these are trends in the United States. 50% of our municipal waste that was generated is landfilled, and the largest component is food waste. Plastics is around 18%, paper and paperboard 12%, rubber, textiles, leather 11%. 32% was recycled or composted in 2018. 12% was incinerated with energy recovery. And then 6% was managed by other methods. I wanted to talk a little bit about the link between solid waste and climate, because I think it's really, really important. Typically, when a local government looks at greenhouse gas emissions, they primarily focus on emissions from landfills and incinerators. So if you look at an inventory that a local government produces to try to gauge what are the different sources of greenhouse gases, waste management typically accounts for 1 to 5%. But we're looking at things the wrong way. And US EPA in 2009 produced a landmark report, a really great report that described how 42% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the US are associated with energy used to produce, process, transport, and dispose of the food we eat and the goods that we use. 29% of the greenhouse gas emissions result from the provision of goods produced in the United States, and then the provision of food contributes another 13%. And this means that the way we manufacture, use, dispose of our goods and food is responsible for nearly half of our climate impact. So the more we buy, the more energy it takes to make new products and goods, and that's having an accelerating impact on energy use and climate change. So it's something I think we need to really convey to local governments, that they've got to, that waste management has a much greater impact on our greenhouse gas emissions when you take into account the emissions that are generated by the food we consume and the goods that we use. I wanted to just point out, go back to food and organic waste. It's really critical that we address this if we want to deal with climate change. Globally, 1/3 of our food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. That's about 1.3 billion tons every year. Most wasted food ends up in landfills where it generates methane. And it's an organic that generates methane. And it's a greenhouse gas that's 25% more potent than CO2 at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So when food goes uneaten, we need to keep in mind where it came from. The resources used to produce it all have significant carbon footprint. Energy went into the production of our food. Wanted to look at our recycling trends over the last 60 years. In 1960, just over 6% of the municipal solid waste that we generated was recycled. Moved up to 16% in 1990. And by then you have communities that are setting up their recycling programs. So, and there's a lot of funding available from the federal and state governments to support those programs, to help communities buy bins, to buy recycling trucks, things like that. So the rate jumped up to 29% in 2000. In 2017 and 2018, we've sort of hit a ceiling with recycling. We're around 32% plus or minus. And that's a very troubling trend. Things have kind of flattened out when it comes to recycling. And I'll get to some of the issues of why that's occurring in a minute. But US recycling rates by material, 2018, discarded paper and cardboard is highly recycled. Glass at about 25%, 9% of plastics, and then 63% of yard trimmings. As I mentioned, recycling rates have been holding at 32% for the past decade. And there's a number of reasons for this. Cities have limited budgets for recycling programs. So if you have to pick between public safety and recycling, you're going to pick public safety. And so the recycling budgets for municipalities have flattened out as well. They haven't grown. And some communities have had to cut back recycling as a result of the budget cuts. We have a wide range of materials and products in use today, and that really causes some challenges for recycling, especially the different types of plastics that we have. We don't do a very good job of educating people about the reasons for recycling. And so what happens is people put food contaminated multi-material packaging and other items in their recycling bin. They really don't belong there. And that creates lower value materials that are harder to market. Local governments are now paying more and more to have those materials recycled. There's uneven services. You know, when you look across this country, even look in Tucson, you have residential recycling, you have both curbside and drop-off, but no recycling for people living in multifamily housing and also the commercial sector, commercial buildings. Have a lot of landfill space, so that tends to depress recycling because it's still pretty reasonable, pretty cheap to send our waste to a landfill. In fact, the city of Tucson operates a landfill very close by. Our garbage isn't being transported by truck long distances. Makes it cheap to throw it away. We have mainly in the Midwest and the Northeast, we have waste energy plants with what I call put or pay contracts. You have to guarantee these plants a certain amount of material on an annual basis because they're expensive plants to build. So they tend to depress recycling as well. And as I mentioned earlier, reduced state and federal funding for recycling programs, although that's changed somewhat with the infrastructure bill that was passed by the US Congress. Now there is some additional funding available at the federal level for recycling infrastructure. And a very important one, the consumer brand companies, they basically have dumped this problem on local governments to solve. And so they're not really part of the solution. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the problem is that we're depending too much on recycling, and we really need a system reset. As I mentioned earlier, we've hit a ceiling, and we need to really shift our focus from a linear economy to go to a recycling economy. But what we really need is a circular economy. So we need to really shift away from thinking from waste management to resource opportunity. We have to go beyond recycling and dealing with products at the end of their life. We need to go upstream to solve the problem. We have to put more emphasis on preventing waste from being created And we have to engage more players than just local governments that are traditionally responsible for waste management. So there is a smarter framework, and that's the goal here is zero waste. And we really want to push economies towards targeting as little as possible waste being sent to landfills and incinerators in the environment. And so we have to change the mindset from wasting to resource management. We have to redesign that current linear production system to closed loop system, which Steve will be talking more about that later. We have to design the waste out of products and rethink our product delivery systems. Got to figure out how to keep materials in use for as long as possible. A lot of things that we recycle, especially plastics, are downcycled. They're not being, we need to have more one-to-one recycling, and we need to figure out how increasing recycling and reuse and repair can benefit the local economy. Here's the zero waste hierarchy. And the interesting thing about the hierarchy is look where recycling and compost is on this hierarchy. It's not very high, it's in the middle. So it's a progression of policies and strategies. We want to start with rethinking, redesigning, reducing, and reuse, and then move to recycling and composting. But it doesn't require us getting to absolutely zero. I tend to think of zero waste as a journey. And many communities have set goals of trying to divert 60 to 80% of their waste from landfills. What isn't zero waste? And this is important because it's an issue we may be facing here in Tucson. It's not 100% recycling. Paper bags are recyclable, but they require resources and energy to create and to use, recycle. So we really want to move to the reusable bag, and then to really, and when we move to reusable, like use those reusable bags on a weekly basis. Zero waste does not include waste energy technologies, which is unfortunately something that the city of Tucson is looking at. They're looking at waste incineration, they're looking at plastic to fuel. The problem with these technologies is that we can save, more energy can be saved and global warming impacts decrease by reducing waste, by reusing products, recycling and composting than we can produce from burning discards. From a recycling climate perspective, it's better to get the carbon molecules in our new products like paper and plastics and not combust them, because then you're releasing the CO2 into the air. We really want to get those into new products, those carbon molecules into new products. So waste to energy tends to move us farther away from, not closer to a circular economy where all resources can be resumed fully back into the system. Extended producer responsibility, which is an issue that's really starting to resonate. A lot of pressure is now being brought on the brand companies, the product manufacturers, people saying, you've got to play a role in solving our waste crisis, our climate crisis. So we're beginning to see more laws at the local and state level that hold product manufacturers accountable for waste that's created by their businesses, to motivate them to design greener products that are more durable, repairable, take responsible for funding recycling programs. And we're beginning to see that, and create take-back programs for hard to recycle products like mattresses and carpeting and batteries and things like that. A couple of states have adopted extended producer responsibility laws. They cover single-use plastics, paper packaging materials, and food serviceware. The producers pay a fee to the state based on how much packaging they sell to consumers. The fees go to a stewardship organization that set up by the brand companies to manage and help develop methods to collect and recycle the covered products. And the big thing is towns now get compensated for managing materials created by the producers. So you're not relying on that limited municipal budget to support your recycling programs. Brands are starting to explore reusable, refillable packaging. Again, there's a big push. Unilever is beginning to test refill stations in stores for personal care and detergent products. There's a startup called Algramo, which I think is mainly in South America. They're rolling out refill stations for detergent and cleaning supplies in laundromats. McDonald's and Burger King are testing reusable containers, coffee cups, reusable container for the Whopper. There's some startup companies that have popped up in San Francisco, Boulder, several other communities that are piloting the use of reusable takeout containers for the restaurant sector. And online, you can go online and there's something called Loop, which is a zero waste shopping platform that offers brand name goods in reusable containers. So we're beginning to see some positive things happening from the brand companies. They're starting to test different alternative delivery mechanisms for their products to get it to move away from single-use packaging. I want to talk briefly about bio-based or compostable materials. This is one where we need to really be careful. We need to proceed with caution. Bio-based plastics, which tend to be made from cornstarch or sugar cane, they're still often disposable or single-use products, and they may compete with land for food crops. They do contain chemical additives, and many really don't disappear, these bioplastics. Instead, they break apart into smaller fragments, including microplastics. Compostable plastic, now that tends to be engineered to fully decompose under certain conditions that are met in industrial composting facilities, large-scale composting facilities. The problem is not all communities have industrial composting, so the compostables end up in the landfill because there's no way to compost it on a widespread basis. There are some interesting bio-based packaging that is being looked at that would be made from non-agricultural crops that are under development, things like algae and seaweed, but we just need to be careful and think through that option. Quickly, zero waste community means everybody's working to solve a problem. The private sector shifting away from throwaway packaging, moving more to refill, reuse alternatives, helping to develop methods to collect. People, that's you and me, taking more responsibility at the back end of the problem for what we buy, consume, and discard. And then government at the federal and state level, and even the local level, bringing stakeholders together through planning and policy and education efforts. So there's a role for local government as well. What can local governments do? Well, if you look at the zero waste communities across the country, they're developing zero waste goals. The city of Tucson has one as part of its climate declaration. They're developing strategies. They're getting the stakeholder groups involved. They're partnering on publicity campaigns to promote low impact living. They're improving opportunities for reuse, repair, and sharing, fostering partnerships to deal with food loss prevention, expanding recycling education, growing that composting infrastructure, which is really important if we want to deal with food loss and food waste, developing ordinances to reduce the use of unnecessary single-use packaging. They're putting funding together to help with local green business and circular economy startups. And at the state and federal level, there are some things that can be done as well. Take back requirements for hard to recycle materials, providing more financial support for materials recovery and infrastructure, and then setting standards, telling the brand companies you have to incorporate a certain amount of recycled content into your products and packaging. And several states have done that, including California. Here's just sort of an overview of what one zero waste community is doing. I'm not really going to dwell here, but it's something you can kind of look at, but it just shows you the range of actions. And San Francisco, I think, is around, they've got, I think their diversion rate right now is around 60%. So they didn't meet their goal to go zero, which was around 80 to 90%. But they've really made some significant progress by taking a comprehensive approach to the issue. Boulder, Colorado, and Berkeley, Fresno, Austin, Texas, Seattle, Arlington, Virginia. There's Boston, Nashville. There are a variety of communities all over the country that are working hard on zero waste. I've given you some links. City of Tucson, quickly. The city back last year in June announced that they wanted to convert the Los Reyes landfill into a sustainability campus. And they've been working on this for since 2020. They came out with a map. They went to the city council. The city council approved renaming the landfill to a sustainability campus. You can see some of the things they'd like to locate there. There's some good things there, like expanded composting, anaerobic digestion for organics, landscape buffer, tree farm. But there are some problem facilities there. As I mentioned earlier, they are taking a serious look at waste incineration. And then the city, the next thing that Tucson Environmental and General Services is they came to the city council with a roadmap for developing a zero waste plan. And they indicated that they are looking at 6 to 8 downstream waste management processing technologies for the campus. They've issued an RFI for technology to vendors to ask them, what do you have? What kind of technologies you have for processing, converting, treating municipal solid waste? And they just issued that RFI a few weeks ago. But the problem with the way the city's approaching zero waste and the sustainability campus is they're not getting the stakeholders involved in the process. And I'm talking about the waste haulers, the compost operators, the recycling firms, the businesses in the community, the property management owners in the community. They really haven't brought them to the table. All of this is being done really behind closed doors. They've hired a consultant, the city, to help them look at, and they're focusing too much on downstream waste management. They're not looking at reuse, recycling, repair, reduction, things like that. So I've kind of laid out what I think the city ought to be doing. First thing is to create a vision for the city. How you define zero waste, set some priorities and goals for zero waste. Do a waste characterization study. Unfortunately, they were relying upon an older study that they did, and they also relying on a study that Phoenix did. Most communities, when they do zero waste plan, they do a waste characterization study to figure out what's in the waste stream, how much is being generated, where is it going. They need to inventory our existing reuse, recycling, and composting infrastructure. They're focusing a lot on creating new things down at the landfill, but we really need to get a handle on what's happening to our materials now in this community. Where can we add value? What can we build on? We really need them to stop looking at waste to energy, waste incineration. That's really poisoning the process, in fact, and it's unfortunate. They are also planning to build a mixed waste materials processing facility at the landfill. They've got some federal funding to build a construction pad. The problem here is there's been no community discussion, stakeholder discussion. It might mean that the single stream recycling program is either dropped or turned into a subscription service. And what mixed waste processing allows them to do is to take everything in one bin where everything's mixed together, and you try to pull recyclables out at the landfill. And the problem with these facilities are they're not very effective at recycling, probably 5 to 15%. And because a lot of material is contaminated, even more than what you would find in your single stream bin. And the last thing we really need to get the city is focus heavily on food loss reduction and the collection of organic waste. Many communities have set up 3-stream recycling programs where you, in addition to a bin for recyclables and a bin for trash, you have a bin for organic waste, your food waste, your yard trimmings, things like that. So that's my presentation, and I think Stuart, probably this is a good time to do some questions or comments.
Super. Why you want to unshare the thing so we can all see each other's faces?
Yeah, I'll do that.
And thank you for this very thorough and far-ranging presentation. Please feel free to unmute and ask your question or raise a hand. I'll begin with just one question. You talked about the biobags and other compostables as being questionable. I had believed until now that biobag in which we could put our compostables and which would disappear within 3 days within our hot compost, that was truly just going back into the earth as nutrients to the soil. Now, is it true though that there's something else that's being left behind from a biobag?
Well, there could be particles from
But
that
what
may
kind of,
contain chemical additives in those biobags that we need to at least be aware of. And I think for some, for people to use a biobag to put their materials in a backyard composting operation doesn't make sense. But if you're going to collect organic waste, what communities are doing is they are looking at plastic bags and paper bags for collecting the organic waste. And before they start the composting process, they have to break open those bags, and they are then discarded. And then they begin processing the food waste and other materials in the bags. So it's kind of a mixed, it's a mixed bag, essentially, when I think about biobags. And there might be a role there, but we're sort of in a wait and see mode right now.
Well, one thing to add to that is that a lot of these biopolymers, even though they break down, they're breaking down still into components of microplastics. Because these polymers are, even though they're made out of biologically sourced materials, the polymer form is very similar to what's made out of petroleum. So you're not guaranteed that you're not going to get microplastics just because you have a compostable plastic out of it.
So what does that actually mean? Like, it's made from something natural and organic, but it's a polymer. Does that mean that it just is not able to biodegrade and disappear, but exists in perpetuity? Like where can you talk a little more?
Yeah, I think go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, it's able to degrade in large part, but not necessarily down to the monomer form that was used to make that polymer. And even some of the monomer forms are not very easily usable in an organic stream. So yes, it's better than a single-use plastic that doesn't degrade, but it still does not completely eliminate the feeding of small particles of plastic into the environment.
And what impact would that have on the environment? Because I'm assuming we're talking at a minuscule level. So, when I'm thinking about plastics, being ingested by animals, it's not at that level, but it would be at a level of contaminating soil and water. Or what would the impact of that microplastic be?
Well, microplastics tend to get, the smaller they are, the more dangerous they are, in fact, because then they get into our bodies. Fish, for example, in the ocean now, and ocean mammals, et cetera, have significant levels of microplastics in their body. And your body, like any foreign object, is not real happy with that. So
we're talking about a poisoning of toxicity.
Well, whether it's toxic or not, how toxic it is still up for debate, but it's certainly.
Yeah, there's a lot of ongoing research. My concern too is upstream, some of these bio-based products, compostable products, promote the continued use of throwaway products. I mean, one of the restaurants we go to, they have a compostable box that they use. I'm happy they're doing that, but what do I do with a compostable box now? If I don't do backyard composting, actually, I bought and I wouldn't recommend anybody do this, but I bought a countertop food waste composting machine. It's about this big, and I can make compost in 3 to 5 hours. And I'm not going to do composting in my backyard. Now, if the city provided organic waste pickup or provided some drop off around the city, I would probably participate something like that. But I can make compost, and I can take those compostable. What I do with that compostable containers, I'll cut it up into small pieces and mix it in with food waste and other materials. But I'm still buying that. The problem is I'm still getting a compostable container that's made with energy. And it's much better to go with a reusable container or someplace, something I can get from the restaurant that I can then drop off somewhere, gets picked up, gets cleaned, given back to the restaurant. That's better than composting or compostable and bio-based, provided I actually participate in that program.
Or there is something new coming up too, which is films for coating food. And they are not polymeric films. They are made from structural items of fruits and vegetables that are then mashed down into a liquid form with lots of fibers in it that is then used to coat the film, and when it dries out, it forms a seal. But then it's washable or edible after that, unlike the biopolymers.
I missed the very first part of that, Stephen. What is that called?
Well, there's a product called Apeel, A-P-E-E-L, for example, which is being used to coat avocados.
Okay.
There are a lot of other similar products being developed, which are used from skins and fruits, whatever is available, mashed down into very small fibers, then put into a paste, which is then made into a liquid or more liquid paste, sprayed on. As it dries, it forms a seal, these fibers. But the fibers are not polymerized as the plastics are. They're just structurally packed together. And they are all completely usable by your body.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And I want to say I'm not against getting rid of all plastics. There are some very beneficial uses, particularly in the medical sector. We have to address how those plastics are being recovered, and hopefully they can then use that to make new plastic products. But the unnecessary single use, that's where we've gone bonkers with, and we really need to come up with new product delivery systems that are more reuse, refill based to phase those out over time.
Laura's had her hand up, and Christy, I thought you wanted to say something. So how about Laura, Christy, and then our Zoom account?
I'm wondering if the city of Tucson, Kevin, do you know if the city has ever seriously considered or analyzed the feasibility of a 3-bin system for single family homes, so we would have that composting yard waste bin?
What the problem with the city of Tucson is they haven't brought the stakeholders together to talk about different collection options. I mean, they are having a problem with their current system. They are having high contamination rates.
Yeah.
And that's an issue. We need to find out more about that. I know they've been doing some soft enforcement tagging. They got a grant to do that. But the problem is that you need to bring the stakeholders together to look at the issues that they're facing, look at alternatives to that. And that could include more enforcement. It could, to deal with contamination, it could include more education. You know, the city lost their recycling education person, and I don't think she's been replaced. And, you know, that department's underfunded. And I understand it, I get it. But they need to bring the stakeholders together to talk about the issues they're facing. What can we do to encourage more reduction? What can we do to better collect materials, including a 3-stream system? There's plenty of data out there from other cities that we ought to be looking at. There's some great reports that are looking at improvements. The problem is it's a process problem. They aren't bringing, I mean, we ought to think about a universal recycling ordinance that covers multifamily buildings and the commercial sector. A number of
I was
communities
actually
have
going to
done
ask
that.
you about that too. Yeah.
Yeah, they have.
Have they ever seriously assessed that?
I don't know. That's the problem. When you do a zero waste plan, that's why you bring the stakeholders together to talk about to review your current situation, look at alternatives, and then try to figure out what might make sense for Tucson. And my sense is I'm concerned about this mixed waste materials processing facility. Want to build at the landfill because they could move to a 1-bin system. Now, I think what they would probably do is go to 1 bin and then go to subscription. You'd have to opt in to the recycling program. And that they may set up some drop-offs for organics, but I think we ought to at least assess in a very systematic way what it would cost to make improvements, including a 3-stream system. Now, maybe it'll be too expensive. I don't know, but we need to at least evaluate it, and you need to do it in a very open and inclusive way.
And one other quick question. I'm sorry, everybody. The figures you presented on waste composition, were those national? Like, do we know how much of Tucson's waste is organic and compostable?
Those are national figures.
Yeah.
Now, the RFI they just issued, they did provide some information on the waste composition for Tucson, but they said it was based on an older study that they did and a Phoenix study. Now, what I would have liked to have found out, when were these studies done? How old is that study? Is it 10 years old that they did it? Or when did Phoenix do their waste analysis? I really, but they do have some information.
Do you know what the figure is that they're using, even if we don't know how realistic it is?
What I can do
It's
is
gotta be ballpark.
follow up to get you the pie chart that will show you what the breakdown is for. The problem is they give you a breakdown on the types, but they don't necessarily tell you the quantities for each type.
Thank you.
I'm gonna have to jump in here. I want to give Christy a chance. I think you had a comment.
I just thought of something, Kevin, and that is something I forget, but when you go out to eat, take your own container for leftovers. Such a simple solution. How can I remember it? I don't know. But if we have time later, Stuart, I'm not sure. How do we compare globally with waste? Have you seen numbers on that, Kevin? Like Europe used to be.
Europe is doing better than we are, but they rely heavily on waste energy, and they're beginning to rethink that because their waste energy plants emit greenhouse gases, and they're starting to realize that might prevent them from meeting their climate goals, but they're doing better. Australia is probably comparable with the United States. Canada is doing better. They've got some wonderful programs like in a number of cities up there that could be a model for including 3-stream collection systems. In fact, they do something interesting in some Canadian cities. They only pick up your you get 3 bins. They pick up your compostables and your recycling once a week, and they pick up your garbage. Twice a month. So they've kind of reversed what's going on in Tucson, and to encourage people to divert organics and recyclables, because you don't want to leave your food waste in the garbage can for 2 weeks. So you're motivated, and they're also doing a better job of enforcing. And that's a tricky issue politically. You're going to start tagging, and they've even, some of the cities say if they find contamination a second or third time, you're cut off for a while. So they have more robust enforcement systems in Canada, where China, developing countries like India, I don't know if you call China a developing country or not, but they're starting to replicate some of our bad practices here in the United States. I mean, when you look at the plastics industry, where do they see their growth areas? Asia, Africa. That's where they want to market more product. They are pivoting away from making transportation fuels and fuels for energy production. They read the handwriting on the wall. They see that, but they're pivoting now to plastics production as a plan B. And they look at growth markets like in Asia, South America, other places to sell more plastic products, especially throwaway products.
So much to think about, so much to do. We're going to take a short break. I'm sorry, Zoom account, Tracer Paula, please hold your question and let's see if we can get to it after our break. So we will take 5 minutes, which means that at 11:03 we'll be back. And Kevin, this is very stimulating as you do.
I can. You want me to bring it up, Stephen, and then just tell me when to.
Okay, we can't hear you, Stephen.
Sorry. Yes, I'll take care of it, Kevin. I'll give it a try.
Oh, super. Okay, so that means I'll make you, Stephen, a co-host. And pretty soon everybody will be one. And that'll be just fine.
You want me to start?
Well, let me just say a word. Stephen's going to address us on the topic of the circular economy, which Kevin brought out in his presentation. Little background, Stephen was born and raised on a rotational, mostly sustainable mixed crop livestock farm in Nebraska, right in the heart of our country. He was so fascinated with biological systems and structures that he got a PhD in molecular biology. He eventually became an associate professor of enology, which he can explain to us. It has to do with viticulture, raising of wine. His career was spent in quality assurance, sustainable enology, viticulture startups, aroma research. So here's a man who's thought a lot about the particulars of those things that attract and please us in this world. He lived for 10 years, no, for about 7 years in Tucson and Sonoita back in the 90s. Came back to Tucson in 2018. He sees the goal of sustainability as a guiding star by which we can, as a society, restore and preserve the balance of nature and humanity. In particular, he believes that small local circular economy startups provide a vital and practical model for a sustainable future. A restructuring of society into diverse and self-sufficient localized units among a global web of such entities. Stephen will give us a view of why and how that can happen here in Tucson and across the nation. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, I don't see my PowerPoint, even though I've got it up.
Okay.
Well, let me try this.
Kevin, why don't you get yours ready as a backup, just in case?
I did what you said, Kevin. I opened up my presentation ahead of time and then I hit share and it gives me blanks. I'm just going to go to.
Let me see if I can bring it up
presentation.
real quick and then.
Can you see it now?
No, Kevin's working on it.
Can you see my PowerPoint at this point?
No, Stephen, sorry.
No. Okay.
Okay, here comes. Kevin's got it.
Okay. Hey,
So
Kevin,
Steve-
can you put it into slideshow mode and start from beginning?
Stephen, it looks like he's there, so
Well, I'd like to see the full screen.
of course.
Just go over to play from start.
Yeah, hold on.
From my view, he does have that.
Oh, okay. I don't see it. All right.
I'll try again. I think I've got
There we
it.
go. There. Now you got it.
Okay.
Okay. So circular economy is a concept that is, as Kevin enumerated in various ways, is starting to become into practice more and more. So this is what I call the simple or perfect model of the circular economy. So nothing's coming into it, nothing's going out of it. It's all a completely closed loop, which of course is not realistic and certainly not what we have now. But it gives you the idea of what we're striving for. So you produce something, you distribute it, you consume or use it, might be a better way of thinking. Then you either reuse it, repair it, or recycle it. And then the recycling sector gives you then that feedstock for new production. And the next slide, Kevin. Can I have the next slide? There we go. So current linear economy is as a different way of putting it than what Kevin did. I say extract, use, and toss, because extraction, mining and petroleum, etc., is still part of the mix. We don't have all the materials we need in the recycling stream at this point. And in your toss it, as Kevin said, that the recycling part of that is not very efficient. And still a lot of it ends up in the landfill. So the current sort of carbon division that's accepted by, these figures come from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the World Circular Economy Forum. About 55% of this current linear economy carbon that is released to the environment is linked to sourcing, using, and waste byproducts of energy feedstocks, mostly oil and coal. Renewable energy, of course, is not part of that linear economy. It's supposedly going to be used for circular economy. However, at this point, it's just supplementing the linear economy. So 45% of the carbon is coming from consumer products, the feedstocks that are sourced, produced, used, and wasted by consumers. Next slide. So this is a little more complicated, taking the circular economy by sectors and putting in some of the outcomes that we like, such as equity, transparency, and resilience. And you can see by the symbols you have energy, water, bioresources, justice, health, the economy, and then materials that need to be sourced through mining or some other extraction process. And the next slide. Now, this is what's been developed by MacArthur Foundation. It's called the butterfly diagram of the circular economy. And it is a globally systemic model. What do I mean by globally systemic? It means that all the parts are interrelated and each of them has a feedback to the rest of the circular model. And this is where quality control comes into play. And this has sort of been my thing over the years is quality assurance, trying to figure out how to design systems so that you then have the most efficient and least wasteful system that you can do. This would be almost ideal, except you can see down at the bottom there's a bit of leakage out of that circular model. On the left side of the model is for your bioresources. That includes the farming and forestry, fishery type of activities, and some chemistry that's done on producing that. And you can see down at the bottom green arrow, there's a little bit of leakage out there. Not all of it gets used again. Same thing with the right-hand side, which is our feedstocks that are coming out of finite materials that we are extracting from somewhere. And even in a perfect system, the user doesn't always get all of them back into recycle or reuse. There's a bit of leakage. At this point in time, those leakages on both of those are far from minor. They're, in fact, the major component at this point in our linear economy. So how do we transition? Can I have the next slide, please? Well, we need to change our, as Kevin said, change our ideas on how we handle carbon. So we could eliminate most of that 55% of energy carbon by using renewables, plus recycling carbon back into agriculture and forestry and fishing. And that could eliminate most of our carbon pollution that's either going into the air or the biggest sink right now is the ocean. Circular economy, if we got that for the consumer goods, and we use renewable energy to power a lot of that manufacturing and processing after use, we could eliminate most of that 45% carbon release that's embedded in the production, use, and waste of consumer goods. Next slide, please. So if we believe in this globally systemic model, and I said that it's totally interconnected, what are the resulting changes from designing a totally interconnected system? Well, first of all, your environmental waste would be reduced. That means less CO2, methane are going in the atmosphere and less warming resulting from that. In fact, we may be beyond the point where we can just look at reducing that. We may have to actually start taking carbon out of the air. There are some systems being developed, although they're very expensive at this point in time, and they use up a lot of renewable energy to extract carbon out of dilute atmospheric intake. And they may hold some promise, but probably not going to happen quickly. But if we can develop all of these renewables to the point where they're accounting for most of the energy production, and we can take some of that carbon air out of the air with processes I just talked about, there'll be much less feedstock waste to the air, fresh water, ocean. It would also reduce the plastics, ocean acidity, and fertilizer problems that we have with water and salt water both. The main benefit out of it is you get an ecosystem that is in stasis again, instead of in a state of degradation as it is now, with forests being taken out, monoculture farming, lots of fertilizer inputs and lots of fossil energy inputs in terms of the actual farming process. And once you have a more stable ecosystem with less pollution and with more sourcing from local and more natural kind of inputs for our food, and better attention to the justice on a local level, human health will be enhanced as well. So these are all sort of, shall I say, design elements of improving the whole ecosystem of the earth and our social ecosystem through the circular model. Next slide, please. What does it mean economically? Well, the main thing you get out of not going to single linear stream of waste and reusing materials, or you're using them less and having them last longer, is that your efficiency is enhanced. This is the carrot for business. And it's starting to be realized in some ways, because the financing for businesses is tending toward more circular models because they are more efficient. And what do I mean by efficiency? Well, first, your extraction feedstock wastes are reduced because your products are lasting longer, being reused or fixed. Transporting of feedstock is a real big user of energy. And it's not free from generating more waste as well, because oftentimes in transport, especially food transport, a lot of that stuff that's being transported gets wasted. In fact, it's a major problem with food. About 40% of food never gets to its intended end. This is a worldwide problem. What happens then if you have better transport and more local use? That means that that money that's being used for transport and production gets distributed more equally. So you have that wealth more equally distributed, which is better for the social constructs that we have. And when you make the agricultural and forestry feedstocks renewable, it naturally increases biodiversity. One good current example of that is some economics that just came out of Brazil, where they have a particular nut, not one we're familiar with, but that is usable for its oil and as a source of nutraceuticals. That tree right now is being cut down, and each person that delivers that tree, mostly native societies, is getting the equivalent of $5 a tree. If you harvest the nuts instead of cutting down the tree and deliver them to the market, it's a little more expensive, but not too much, and you get $12 per tree, and you get it every year. So the efficiency of having a biodiverse system for your ag and forestry feedstocks makes so much sense now that businesses are starting to say, hey, I'm going to jump on board. It's kind of interesting that a large sector of the financial community now is starting to fund circular economy businesses on both small and large scales. Next slide, please. So how do we do this transition to the circular economy from the linear? Well, we know it's got to happen quickly. Most of you have heard of the Code Red designation by the United Nations. Well, it's actually moving faster even than that. Some of the latest research and data out on what's happening in the Arctic, it's going much, much faster, the melting of the sea ice and the melting of the tundra than it was ever supposed to be at this point. We have not been meeting our Paris Accord goals worldwide on CO2 production. And so we're actually tipping the balance further toward the disaster scenario than even the Code Red suggests. This has to be done quickly, and it has to be done on all scales, from global to local. So on a global level, probably most of the effort will go into awareness, getting people to realize that they need to do this and that it's doable, and setting policy that says, yes, this is what we can do to achieve this, and we're all going to agree on it to some degree or the other. You're never going to get perfect agreement. On a national or regional level, and by regional it could be several nations or it could be regions within a nation, you're looking at equity transition. And what do we mean by that? That means that equity is what you have for your resources. That could be the natural resources, it could be the consumer goods, it could be the energy itself as a commodity, or it could be the social construct that sets that up so that everybody benefits. So equity transition is what we have to get to from our current system to a truly renewable system, such as a circular economy. That takes a lot of political will. So this is where we need to get involved in terms of voting, in terms of making our voices heard, is saying we need to transition to a place where everybody in the society benefits, not just a few. And that's what I mean by equity transition. And selling the idea that everybody benefits equally is not the way to do it. To say everybody benefits so that people can have a little more or a little less than the average, but overall the distribution is much more equal than it is now. So what happens on a local level, I call it a community level, is that this idea of having a circular economy or a circular renewable society has to involve everybody. So all the entities, and hopefully the smaller they are, the easier this is to achieve. The for-profit, nonprofit, governmental, and social organizations all have to be on the same page and all talking to each other. And the result of this hopefully will be a more broad-based consensus and a more distributed way of living. And the next slide, please. So what are the drivers of this? Getting small entities operating from circular principles is one of the main drivers, as I just talked about. If you have stuff that's a business in a neighborhood, people work in that neighborhood at that business, and that neighborhood is livable because it has those businesses and it also has the other amenities that it needs, and it has the government help on a local basis. That leads to more equitable economics, more conservation of the environment and any resource. And essentially because people are all participating in a productive way, you get more social justice. Next slide, please. The other drivers are to remain at a sustainable scale. This is not the way that our capitalistic society works at this moment. And there's nothing wrong with capitalism, but rampant capitalism as it is currently practiced, there are some real problems with it. One of the biggest problems is everybody wants to get huge. So we have to remain at what I call a sustainable scale. That may be a business with 5 people, maybe a business with 100 people, but it's certainly not a business with 10,000 people distributed all over the nation. There's going to be some of those that have to exist for certain sectors, But in terms of making this transition, local is the real driver that has to be retained. That means most of the products that we use are better off for us if they're locally produced. Not every product's going to happen like that. Economies of scale have been the driving force of our economy as it is. And changing that idea that you have to make things in one place at large scale more cheaply and transport it a long ways, it doesn't take into account waste, doesn't take into account carbon release. The more local we get it, the more control we have over the circularity of the process. And ideally, as I said, this local consumption would occur in distributed neighborhoods where everybody lives, that these products are produced. The last point, and we have to get rid of all this extra trash that Kevin has spent a lot of time enumerating. And we need to have better innovations in how we use our recycled feedstock, because there's going to have to be some recycling. It's not a perfect system. We can't just make a product and use it forever. We do sometimes have to repurpose it or break it down and reuse it. So one of the ways we can aid in this transition is by coming up with some innovative ways of using our recycled feedstocks to get rid of that extra waste and make it into more long-lasting and reusable materials and products. What does that do? Gets rid of the waste, number one, and hopefully gets people in the idea that they don't have to have waste, that they can actually make things make things last longer, and you'll have to do less of this recycling. And hopefully then it would also get rid of most of the landfill products that are going in there now. Next slide, please. So that's kind of finishing what I wanted to get. It's more of a conceptual idea of what Kevin did the nuts and bolts of. And what I want to get across the idea is that circular economy is not something we cannot achieve, at least on a large part. The transition does not have to be as painful as everybody is making it out to be. And I'm not saying that fossil fuels is making out the problem, but they're certainly one of the people. And the other part is a much more equitable system if you're producing things locally, using them locally, and that money is circulating back through the local economy. Everybody knows about the multiplier effect of local money. So I want to acknowledge some of the sources that I used here. So the first slide, the simple model was created by Jen Fredette, who is a writer for a company called Biomimicry, which does a lot of nice work on information about circular economy. The other slide with the sectors was by Ava Grajek of Metabolic, which is another corporation heavily involved in trying to promote circular economy and resource conservation. The butterfly diagram was by Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And I highly recommend the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as a resource for all of this material on circularity of economies and financing of the new economy as they hope it will develop, etc. It's a great resource. I'm working on something that I hope to have in the next year or two, and I've started on it, and some of the sustainable people have seen my first drafts of the sketch of it. And it'll be a guide to small local circular economy startups. In other words, how do we achieve this distributed local businesses in neighborhoods by the way we design the business from the start and how it's going to grow to its sustainable scale. So all of this is hard work. All of it is gloomy in terms of where we are at, in terms of where we need to get to. So I try to keep this in mind that we need to think big. That is, we got big problems to solve, but act in small kindnesses. In other words, every day do the things that make our world a little better. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much for just giving a deeper look at what circular economy actually means. So if you have a question, please be sure it's brief And it's a question, not a statement at this point. We don't have time for anything other than some questions and a few responses from Stephen and then Kevin as well. So Laura, would you like to start us off? You have to unmute.
I'm curious if you're familiar with Local First Arizona and if you've tried to approach them about working on circularity in local entities.
Yes, I have approached them and we have had some talks. They want a startup business that I operate as well as having the guide. And so far, I don't have a location for the two businesses that we're starting up yet. You have to pay for a place to have a business, unfortunately. Right now, my businesses are running out of my house. That doesn't satisfy Local First Arizona's program of enhancement of startups. But I've also been in contact with Startup Tucson, Arizona Forge, Tucson, Visit Tucson, and a couple others on this idea. And they're interested, but they want to see the guide. They want to say, yeah, that's very nice. We like circular ideas, but how does it really work in practice? So I've got a lot more work to do, but I think before I can convince them this is a path to go down.
Let me also say that Local First Arizona has put together a green team, and both Donna Corbin, who's in this ambassadors class, and I have been attending these bi-weekly meetings, and it includes mostly folks up from the Phoenix area, but there's interest in working on food waste, reusable packaging. So they've been the green team's been sort of brainstorming. It's their collaborative project that Tucson and Phoenix representatives can work on.
Actually, Laura, I applied for the job for sustainable ag coordinator up in Phoenix, but I didn't get it. Somebody else got it for Local First Arizona.
And they will be presenting to us on the last day of our training. So it'll be great to talk to them. Okay, so let's see, Trace or Paula, you had a question.
Well, we've got two questions here. Paul first.
So my question for Kevin back a ways was, you talked about take back programs, and I wonder if there's been any looking at what companies do if and when they take back materials. What happens, for instance, to mattresses or other large things that get taken back?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Take back programs are usually mandated by the state, or they're a voluntary program that a group of brand companies have decided to create, like for recovering mattresses or used oil or batteries, carpeting. And the carpeting program, some of the material that's recovered is made into new carpeting, but some of it ends up in the waste energy plant as well. So it's kind of a mix, and it's an important question to ask if you're going to be. It's important to look at the entire life cycle of the product and deciding what are the most sustainable ways to manage it once you've collected it.
That's where the extended producer responsibility is coming in. There's a carpet manufacturer in Europe, I don't know, Sweden or someplace, I don't remember now, that actually is making carpet that is completely reusable, and they have a program that helps pay for collecting it and getting it back to the factory. Not completely carbon free, because transport is not yet totally free in terms of carbon, but it's much better. And they claim they can reuse this particular material they've developed many, many times.
Yeah, Interface in Georgia, and it's been a while. I really haven't been monitoring their program in the last few years, but they created a program where they will rent the carpeting to the business or corporation or what have you, and then every so often they will take it back and replace it. Of course, so they're sort of getting you on a subscription program. You're a captive user, but they've made a commitment to use a large percentage of the material that they take back to make new carpeting.
That's good. Okay.
I just want to highlight a point. I don't think we have time to comment, but the question we also ask is, what is that material? And given that when things are used, there's wear and tear, and that means micro materials getting into our dust, and that could mean into our lungs or into our soil and water. For example, one of the greatest sources of the PFAS chemicals that we'll be hearing about in July at our monthly meeting is from carpets, because at least in residents' bodies, because companies were putting Teflon type materials on carpets so they'd be easier to clean. But then you're scuffing the thing and you're getting that loosened and then you breathe it. So I think that I'd love to hear more about what that carpet is made of, but it's time for Trace to ask his question.
Yeah, I've got two of them. Kevin, as the sustainability park idea, it sounds like it's got a bunch of processing capabilities. 25 years ago, there was a proposal for an eco-industrial park at the landfill. And that would have had a lot of users of that materials as well. Do you know if any of that is being planned for this by the city?
Well, I think what the city is interested in looking at those options at the Los Reales. They're trying to reimagine what the Los Reales landfill will look like. It's a city-owned operation. The city also collects waste as well, so there's some synergies there. So they put out an RFI, and Grace, I'll send it to you, where they're requesting information from vendors on the types of businesses that could be located there. We how process the waste, convert it. Now that's a term makes me nervous, because conversion could mean taking plastic wrap and bags and turning it into a fuel, which I think would be a huge mistake. And they're also looking at recycling businesses that could be. But so they want to do something down there. They've got an RFI. They're inviting vendors to provide information on types of facilities they could locate down at the park or campus.
And Stephen, do you know of anybody in the world who has attempted successfully small level, like block or neighborhood level composting?
Well, actually, from years ago when I lived in Saskatchewan, city of Saskatoon did that. I don't know if they still do it or not. We actually had neighborhood collection of yard waste and food waste as well every week from a neighborhood container we had. Not every part of the city did it, but I'd say at least 50% of the city did it. Now that was in the 80s or 70s, late 70s, early 80s. So I'm not sure if it still exists, but it was just part of the garden. You know, the city had a composting facility that everybody could come and get their compost for free, and then take it back. And as I said earlier in other sessions, in Canada, there's a big gardening ethic. So a lot of that material was just naturally going back into people's gardens without them individually composting it. They would let the city do it.
I was just wondering, because the way that the city has planned it, I assume, is to collect everything, bring it to a central or a few central composting sites, and then get that back to people. But, you know, involving thousands of miles of driving every day by all those trucks and everything. I was just wondering.
Well,
And it only
that's
wor-
one of the reasons where I think the city's interested in looking at mixed waste processing, because they'd only have to run one truck through many parts of the city as opposed to two. And of course, I'd be interested in the third truck potentially. But let me say that Palm Springs has a group called Desert Composters, and they're setting up composting clubs throughout the community. And there are a number of other communities that are piloting both curbside and drop-off sites for organic waste. So we're beginning to see some experiments taking place out there. I'll be very interested to see what happens in Palm Springs, because it's a desert city. That's something that could perhaps be replicated in Tucson.
And Trace, to sort of further answer that question, I've been looking at some cities that do a volunteer small scale distributed collection efforts. In fact, we have one right here with just aluminum. I have a guy comes to our neighborhood every week and looks for your can set out there with aluminum cans in it, takes them and uses them to help fund a nonprofit for children. And I think that at some point, if you're going to get into the idea of having livable neighborhoods, a collection system that uses part volunteers and part maybe an Uber style pickup might be doable. I'm working on a plan. I haven't gotten it to work yet, but I'm trying to figure out that system of collection. But it depends to succeed upon multi-stream feedstocks, not just 1, 2, or 3, but maybe 7 or 10 different collectibles that you would each have a small network that would gather it into a little larger networks to where it could get to the eventual user, which hopefully would be somebody local. Minneapolis has a 7 stream system that they're working on right now, and they've gotten fairly good buy-in on it. To me, you don't get a circular economy, you don't get a distributed set of startups that are small and sustainable without having a collection system that's distributed. We just haven't figured out how to do it yet.
And I want to just point out, if you do something like that, and Stephen hinted at it, you've got to have a good communications campaign, educational campaign, to convince people this is the right thing to do. And that's why I think we ought to be tying a lot of this to the climate plan that the city's developing. Make zero waste a key component in that climate plan. In fact, we're getting some comments together to push the city in that direction. We'll see what happens, but we need a kind of a comprehensive approach, and that might be the best place to talk about it.
As you can see, the Zero Waste Working Group is a real incubator of ideas that are reaching to top levels of our city management system, and working at the root, also creating new startups as Stephen's describing. So several of you met just 2 days ago to talk about the Greene Retrofit idea, which is kind of a follow-up on sustainable housing that David Eisenberg presented and that Trace has been promoting for a long time. And we're all ignited about that, and a few more of you will be meeting with us at 1 o'clock to continue that conversation. But if you have any more time or interest, or you weren't in on those conversations, joining with the Zero Waste Group would be.
Yeah, I would like to make a short commercial. We do have a Zero Waste Working Group, and we're trying to focus on different areas. You know, Stephen and Rocky are leading on our repair reuse. We've got the Reuse Cafe. They're looking at reusable container project with the restaurant sector. I'm trying to monitor what's going on with the city's sustainability campus and zero waste planning efforts. Donna Corbin, who's a member of the Ambassadors Program, is starting to focus on what are partnerships that can be created with the private and public sector to promote more food rescue, more food donation. And she's trying to convene a working group. So if anybody's interested in joining our group and wants to focus in a certain area, I could certainly use some help from somebody who could be looking at some of the more advanced, innovative things that are happening around the country for collecting materials. We need to really focus on that collection system. So if anybody's interested, or if you have an idea you want to, that's waste related and you want to push, we could be a venue for that. We meet every month, usually the second Monday of the month, and we do it by Zoom.
It is a can-do committee, and as you can tell, there's a lot of research and experience that Steve and Kevin bring in, and there's a lot of fresh new ideas also being surfaced. And Rocky just graduated from UA a year ago, and with Stephen leading the charge on the Repair Cafe. So we have time just for one more question, and then as you can tell, our review session has been simply happening through our questions and answers today. And Jan, let's hear from you. You'll need to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm wondering in terms of this expansion or engaging stakeholders and also building relationships and partnerships. So it's kind of going across both of your presentations. What your thoughts might be about engaging youth, maybe in the form of high schools, the university, ASU and U of A, potential for partnerships around research. Also fueling education awareness.
Early on in the process, we gave the city comments and suggestions, and met with the head of the Environmental General Services Department and said, look at what other cities are doing when they launch their zero waste programs. They bring everybody together, which includes academics. And because we've got a lot of unique talent in this community that could be a resource for coming up with new programs and policies. But you also need those entities to help implement, to be ambassadors for those programs. And because the city obviously can't do it all on their own.
We do have some involvement with the compost cats, for example, trying to figure out exactly how they fit into the zero waste structure with their composting program. Unfortunately, they work on an academic schedule, so they're not around right now. But they are also partnering with the city to develop some commercial pickups of food waste as well, although it seems to be running into a scalability problem. There are high school groups that and we talked to some of them in an ambassador program last year that are very interested in this, and they have set themselves up as independent organizations to look at sustainability. But I don't think they have a system of communication that gets to all the other organizations. So I think Sustainable Tucson has put itself in a position of trying to become a network builder, but it's not an easy job. And the Vaster program is probably one of the best ways of getting it going, but that's sort of an ongoing effort that has to be maintained at a high level to keep that network growing and still accountable. By accountable, I mean interconnected continuously.
And is anything going on in these areas in the county? From the county government?
Well, that would be an area where I think we need to explore more intentionally. The county has a sustainability plan. Now it's primarily for county operations, and they have a sustainability coordinator. So I think it would be worthwhile to start a discussion with a sustainability coordinator.
We had our HOA had our supervisor, Scott. Doug Scott came over to talk to us about other issues, but we brought up various things about how to make the neighborhood better and more sustainable, and he seemed very open. And I think the other supervisors now are beginning to look at that, that the issues involved in sustainability, because as I pointed out in my presentation, it's more efficient if you do it in a sustainable way.